Cops shave black general woman's hair, unaware she is a highly decorated U.S. military general. What if a single moment in a quiet police station could strip away not only a woman's dignity, but also reveal the deepest cracks in our society? Picture this, a woman in her late 30s standing tall, though her wrists are bound. The fluorescent lights hum above her as a pair of officers argue over protocol, their voices sharp against the silence of the holding room. Her hair, once neatly braided like a crown, lies scattered on the cold floor, shaved away without her consent, without even a question of who she was. To them, she was just another detainee. But what they didn't realize was that beneath the uniform they mocked, she carried decades of service, medals earned in silence, and a name whispered with respect in military halls. Where are you watching from today? Because this story will take you into that room and far beyond it. Her name was Angela Morris, though the officers that night never asked. At 38, she carried herself with the calm strength of someone who had spent her life in service. She'd grown up in Georgia, the daughter of a teacher and a postal worker, raised in a modest brick home where the American flag hung proudly from the porch. As a girl, Angela had sat on the stoop, listening to her father talk about dignity, how real strength was never in how loud you spoke, but in how steady you stood when no one else did. Those words clung to her through boot camp, through desert heat, and through nights when the sound of gunfire was closer than breath. By the time she retired from active duty, Angela had earned more than her share of stripes. A Bronze Star for valor, 2 tours overseas, and the quiet respect of every soldier who had ever served under her command. She didn't boast, not once. Her medals were tucked away in a small wooden box at the back of her closet, a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. When she walked into civilian life, she carried no rank on her sleeve, only the weight of what she had seen and the quiet pride of survival. But the night everything changed was supposed to be simple. She had been driving back from visiting her mother, who was recovering from surgery, when flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Angela slowed, pulled to the side, rolled her window down. Her license and registration were already in her hand, as she had been trained to keep calm and compliant. The officer approached briskly, his flashlight sweeping across the inside of her car, as if she were a suspect before a word had been exchanged. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, voice clipped. Angela shook her head. "No, officer. Was I speeding?" The man didn't answer right away. His partner, a younger officer with restless eyes, leaned in on the passenger side. They whispered something between them just out of earshot. Angela sat still, hands visible, breathing steady the way she had taught her soldiers to do in the face of chaos. But something in the air told her this wasn't about a traffic violation. Within minutes, she was asked to step out of the car. Confused but cooperative, Angela complied. The road was quiet, save for the low thrum of crickets and the distant rush of passing cars. The older officer frisked her, his tone sharp, while the younger one rifled through her back seat. They found nothing, no weapons, no open containers, not even a broken tail light. Yet their suspicion lingered. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the older one said. Angela blinked. "On what grounds?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, they placed her in cuffs, tight, unnecessary. She could have resisted, but she didn't. She thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed and decided she would face this with patience. Just as she had faced far greater threats overseas, the station smelled of stale coffee and floor polish. The holding room was bare, just a bench and 4 white walls. Angela sat quietly, saying little, waiting for the mistake to clear. But instead of reason, she was met with laughter. 2 female officers entered, one holding a set of clippers. "Time for a little clean-up," one joked. Angela frowned. "I don't understand." "Policy," the other said. "Detainees with braids, lice risk." It wasn't true, and they both knew it. There was no such blanket policy. Yet they acted with the confidence of people who assumed no one would question them. Angela sat frozen for a moment, the weight of disbelief heavier than the cuffs still on her wrists. She had faced enemies who looked her in the eye, but this was cowardice dressed as authority. "Please," she said softly. My hair is not a risk to anyone. But her words fell flat. The clippers buzzed to life, a sharp sound that filled the small room. The first strands fell to the floor, coiling like dark ribbons. Angela shut her eyes and breathed slowly, calling back the sound of her father's voice, the discipline of her training, the promise she had made long ago never to let fear dictate her actions. When they were done, she looked at her reflection in the narrow strip of metal along the wall. A stranger stared back, not because her hair was gone, but because for the first time in years she felt small, stripped not by combat, not by loss, but by the casual cruelty of those who should have known better. One of the officers chuckled. They're much better. Angela said nothing. She wouldn't give them her anger, not here, not now. She sat with her back straight, the way she had on inspection lines, waiting. But deep inside something shifted. She had been disrespected before as a woman, as a black soldier in a military that hadn't always welcomed her. But never like this. Never in the country she had defended, at the hands of those sworn to protect it. What none of them realized was that the woman they had tried to humiliate had already faced fire and come out stronger. The shaving of her hair was not the end of her dignity, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Because Angela wasn't just a woman in a holding cell. She was a highly decorated general, with allies, with a voice, and with a story that was about to ripple far beyond that room. The next morning, sunlight slanted across the narrow windows of the holding room, but Angela had hardly slept. Her scalp tingled where her hair had been shaved, not from pain, but from the strange vulnerability of it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her braids falling in slow motion, scattering across the sterile floor like broken promises. She had survived ambushes and watched friends carried away on stretchers, yet this humiliation lingered heavier than battle wounds. At 7, the shift changed. A young desk clerk, barely 20 if that, walked in with a clipboard. He glanced at Angela, then at the sheet in his hand. His brow furrowed. Wait, what's she doing here? He asked quietly. The older sergeant shrugged. Traffic violation, non-compliance. The boy looked uneasy but said nothing more. He had no rank to challenge anyone, and Angela could see it in his eyes, the silent discomfort of someone who recognized wrong but felt powerless. She didn't blame him. She'd been young once too, learning when to stand tall and when to survive the chain of command. By mid-morning, her release papers were signed. No charges were filed, no fines, nothing. They opened the door and handed her back her belongings, tossing them across the counter as though they were doing her a favor. Her wallet, her phone, her keys, everything intact except for the dignity they'd stripped away. Angela walked out of that building into the crisp morning air. Her car sat in the lot where they'd left it. She slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, her reflection catching faintly in the rearview mirror. She almost didn't recognize herself. She could have gone home. She could have told herself it wasn't worth the fight. That's what they expected. Silence. But as Angela sat there, the phone buzzed in her hand. It was her sister Gloria. Angie, you didn't call last night. Everything okay? Angela hesitated, then sighed. Not really. She told her, voice calm but steady, every detail of what had happened. The silence on the other end grew heavy until Gloria finally spoke. Angie, you have to tell someone. This can't just sit in the dark. Angela had spent her life avoiding attention, doing her duty without fanfare. But Gloria's words stirred something she had long carried. She thought of her soldiers, men and women, who had trusted her with their lives. She had always told them, if you see injustice, you don't look away. And now here she was, tempted to bury her own humiliation because it was easier. That afternoon, Angela drove not to her apartment but to her mother's house. The small brick home was warm, with the smell of chicken soup. Her mother, still recovering from surgery, sat propped in her recliner. She took one look at Angela's shaved head and gasped, "What happened to you?" Angela knelt beside her and took her hand. "It's nothing, Mama." But her mother's grip tightened. "Don't you dare say that. I didn't raise you to swallow hurt like it's air." "Tell me." So Angela told her again. And as the words filled that modest living room, something remarkable happened. Her mother didn't cry or rage. She nodded slowly, eyes steady, and said, "Then you'll fight it, not with anger, with truth. That's how we've always done it." That night, Angela sat at the kitchen table with her sister and drafted a formal complaint. She detailed every moment, every word spoken, every laugh that echoed in that room. Her hands trembled only once when she wrote the sentence, "They cut off my braids without consent." Writing it down made it real, undeniable. Within days, the complaint reached internal affairs. At first, she expected silence, maybe a perfunctory investigation that would fade away. But instead, something unexpected happened. A reporter from the local paper called. Somehow word had reached the press. Angela hadn't planned to go public, but the reporter's voice was firm. "We've received credible reports of misconduct. Would you be willing to share your story?" Angela hesitated. She had always been private, her service known only to those who served with her. But she remembered her mother's words and her own oath long ago, to defend, to protect, to stand. She agreed on one condition, that they tell the truth, fully and fairly. When the article ran, the headline was quiet but sharp. "Former military general alleges police misconduct in local detention." The photo was of Angela in her mother's kitchen, wearing a simple cardigan, her shaved head uncovered. No dramatics, no glamour, just a woman, plain and strong. The response was swift. Letters to the editor poured in, some outraged, others skeptical. Old neighbors called to say they had her back. Former soldiers reached out, voices full of disbelief and support. But not everyone was kind. Online comments brimmed with the usual cruelty. "She's lying. She probably resisted." Just another sob story. Angela read a few, then stopped. She had faced worse than words. But what cut deepest wasn't the strangers. It was the silence from the officers themselves. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just silence. Still, the tide had begun to turn. The city council called for a review. Community leaders demanded accountability. A small rally formed outside the station, with signs reading, "Justice for Angela" and "Dignity for all." Angela didn't attend. She wasn't one for crowds, but she watched from her car at a distance, humbled by strangers chanting her name. One night a box arrived on her doorstep. Inside was an envelope with no return address. She opened it to find a photograph, her unit overseas, standing together in dusty fatigues, arms draped over one another's shoulders. On the back was a note, "We've got your six, always. Charlie Company." Angela sat down hard, tears she hadn't allowed herself finally spilling. It wasn't the public that gave her strength. It was them, the men and women who had marched beside her, who knew the weight she carried and the leader she had been. They reminded her she wasn't fighting alone, but even as the support grew, so did the pressure. A police union spokesperson appeared on local TV, dismissing the claims as procedural necessity. He waved off her account, suggesting she had exaggerated. "Our officers followed standard protocol. No misconduct occurred," he said flatly. Angela watched the broadcast, jaw tight. She wanted to storm the station, demand accountability, but she knew better. She'd seen how systems worked, how truth could be buried under paperwork and politics. This would not be won by rage. It would be won by persistence, and so the battle shifted. Not a battle of bullets or bombs, but of hearings, interviews, and endless questions. Angela attended each one, dressed neatly, speaking calmly. She presented her story not as a victim, but as a witness to injustice. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply told the truth and let the weight of it hang in the air. The twist came weeks later, during one of those hearings. A file was mistakenly passed into evidence, an internal memo written before her release, in which one officer had joked about giving her a buzz cut to take her down a notch. It was the proof no one expected. The kind of slip that pulled the curtain back. Angela read it silently, her heart steady. The words stung, but they also validated what she had known all along. This wasn't policy, it was cruelty. And now it was in writing. The room shifted. The committee members leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously. The union rep's face paled. And for the first time since that night, Angela felt the tide truly turn. Still, she knew the road was far from over. The truth was out, but justice was a longer march. As she walked out of that chamber, a young reporter caught her arm. "General Morris," he said softly, "if this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." He smiled awkwardly, catching himself, then added more sincerely, "How do you stay so calm through all this?" Angela looked at him, her voice even. "Because calm is how you win. Anger burns fast. But calm, that's what carries you to the end." In the weeks that followed the leaked memo, Angela's name became a flashpoint. What had once been a private humiliation now pulsed through every corner of her community. Local news covered the hearings nightly. National outlets began to pick it up, weaving her story into wider conversations about dignity, bias, and reform. Some hailed her as a symbol of quiet strength. Others accused her of fabricating for attention. The scrutiny was relentless, and Angela felt its weight most when she was alone. She didn't fear danger. She had lived through far worse. But the exhaustion gnawed at her. Each morning brought another phone call, another interview, another request to relive the night. At first she agreed willingly. But after a while, she found herself pausing longer before answering the phone. Sometimes she let it ring out. One evening, sitting in her living room, Angela stared at the wooden box of medals on her coffee table. She hadn't touched them in years, but now, almost against her will, she lifted the lid. The bronze star glinted in the lamplight. She remembered the day it was pinned to her chest, dusty wind blowing through the desert camp. Her soldiers had cheered, not because of the medal, but because they knew what it meant. She had stood with them, never asking what she wouldn't do herself. Now, staring at that medal, she wondered if her silence would betray them. Could she walk away from this fight? Could she let the noise drown out the truth? That night her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Marcus Hayes, a sergeant she had once mentored overseas. He had since retired too, working now as a security consultant. His words were short but piercing. "Don't let them write your story for you. We still look to you." Angela closed her eyes, her grip tightening on the phone. His message hit like a command, not because of its sharpness, but because of its trust. She thought of all those who had ever looked to her in foxholes, on tarmacs, in the quiet hours before a mission. They hadn't followed her rank. They had followed her steadiness. And that steadiness couldn't end now, but as she resolved to keep going, another blow landed. Internal Affairs announced that despite the memo, the officers involved would remain on duty pending further investigation. Worse, the union began a campaign to discredit her publicly. Anonymous sources claimed she had been combative, that she had refused orders, painting a picture of a woman unrecognizable to those who knew her. The hardest moment came when Angela's niece, just 15, showed her a social media post mocking the shaved head photo from the paper. "Why are people saying this about you, Auntie?" the girl asked, eyes wide with confusion. Angela swallowed hard, pulling the girl close. "Because sometimes, when people don't want to face the truth, they attack the one who speaks it. But you listen to me. Dignity doesn't come from their words. It comes from how you carry yourself, even when they lie." Later that night, when the house was quiet, Angela sat on the porch steps with her sister. Gloria handed her a mug of tea and said softly, "You don't have to do this alone. We're here, always." Angela nodded, but her voice wavered. "I'm tired, Gloria. I've fought enough battles for 2 lifetimes. This one feels different. It's not bullets or bombs. It's shadows and whispers." Gloria squeezed her hand. "Maybe, but remember, shadows disappear when you hold up the light. And you, Angie, you've always been the light." Those words steadied her more than she expected. For the first time in weeks, Angela laughed, a small sound but genuine. It reminded her of late nights as kids, when they'd whisper dreams to each other across their shared bedroom. That bond, family, was her anchor. Days later, the turning point arrived in an unlikely way. Angela was invited to speak at a small community forum organized by local veterans. She hesitated but decided to go, wearing a simple navy blazer. When she walked into the church hall, applause broke out. Old soldiers, young recruits, neighbors and strangers, people who had read her story, stood to greet her. Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected such warmth. She began speaking quietly, telling her story not with outrage, but with the same calm she had shown in the hearing room. She described the night, the clippers, the laughter. She didn't dramatize, didn't embellish. She simply told the truth. At one point, an older veteran rose, his hands trembling on a cane. His voice cracked as he said, "General Morris, I served in Korea. I know what it's like to give everything for a country that sometimes doesn't see you. Don't stop fighting. We need you to finish this one too." The room fell silent, heavy with emotion. Angela met his eyes and nodded slowly. That moment crystallized something for her. This wasn't just her battle. It was a fight for every person whose dignity had been questioned, dismissed or erased. The forum ended with quiet hugs and handshakes. But as she left, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "General Morris," he said, "have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments." It was a clumsy attempt at relatability, but Angela smiled faintly and said, "Yes, and the truth is, it never gets easier. But we can't let fear silence us. Not now, not ever." That clip aired on the evening news. It wasn't flashy, but it struck a chord. Letters poured in, stories from widows, veterans, young mothers, even officers who admitted the system needed change. For the first time, Angela saw the narrative shifting. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was shaping the conversation. And with that realization, the path forward grew clearer. She couldn't undo what had happened to her, but she could ensure it didn't happen again to anyone. That would be her mission now, her new field of battle. By the time the Oversight Committee convened for its final hearing, the city was buzzing with anticipation. Weeks of testimony, letters and articles had turned Angela's case from a local dispute into a national conversation. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras trained on the entrance, as Angela walked up, steady and unhurried, her navy blazer pressed, her chin held high. She carried no entourage, only her sister at her side, but the crowd parted for her as if she was still marching in formation. Inside, the room was packed. Committee members shuffled papers. Police representatives sat rigidly, and at the back, community members filled the benches. The air was heavy, the kind that holds its breath before a storm breaks. Angela was sworn in once more. Her shaved head had begun to show the faint shadow of regrowth, but she hadn't hidden it under a scarf. It had become unintentionally a symbol. She adjusted the microphone and began. "I am not here for vengeance," she said, voice calm. "I am here for dignity. Mine, yes, but also for the dignity of every person who should walk into a station and be treated with respect. The night this happened, I was not asked who I was. I was not seen as a citizen, much less a soldier who has given most of her life to this country. I was seen as less than human. That cannot stand." The committee members scribbled notes. Across the room, the police union rep shifted uncomfortably. He had argued in earlier sessions that the incident was routine procedure, but today the evidence sat heavy against him. The memo, the testimonies, the mounting public outrage. One councilwoman leaned forward. "General Morris, some have argued this was an isolated lapse. What would you say to that?" Angela looked directly at her. "I'd say this: a lapse is forgetting to sign a form. A lapse is leaving a light on. This was not a lapse. This was deliberate, degrading, and done with the confidence that no one would challenge it. That is not a lapse. It is a culture. And culture must be changed," the room murmured. Even some officers in uniform glanced away, their faces betraying quiet recognition. As the hearing continued, testimonies were read aloud. One came from the young desk clerk, who had been on shift that morning. Nervous but resolute, he admitted what he'd seen. The laughter, the casual cruelty, the lack of justification. His honesty broke through the wall of silence that had protected the officers involved. Then came the memo. It was read into record, the joking reference to taking her down a notch. The words echoed like a confession. The committee chair frowned deeply, setting his pen down. The atmosphere shifted. What had once seemed like Angela's word against authority was now undeniable proof of misconduct. For Angela, sitting there, it felt less like victory and more like relief. She had known the truth all along, but seeing it finally acknowledged lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. The climax came when the chief of police himself was called forward. He cleared his throat, face pale under the fluorescent lights. At first, he tried to frame the incident as an aberration, a failure of communication, but under questioning, cracks showed. Finally, pressed by a councilman, he conceded, "The actions taken against Ms. Morris were inappropriate and outside of department policy. Disciplinary measures will follow." The words rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Angela sat still, hands folded, her expression calm. She had learned long ago that true victories were rarely loud. They were quiet acknowledgements, shifts in policy, promises of reform. When the session ended, the crowd spilled outside. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Angela spoke briefly, her words simple. "This was never about one woman. This is about all of us. Change must be more than words. It must be action." That evening, the committee issued its recommendations: immediate suspension of the officers involved, mandatory cultural sensitivity training across the department, and the establishment of an independent review board for future complaints. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning, a tangible step toward accountability. At home, Angela sat once more at her kitchen table, her sister across from her, both tired but smiling faintly. The phone buzzed endlessly with messages of support. One was from the older veteran who had spoken at the community forum. "Proud of you. You carried us all today." Another from Marcus Hayes. "You finished the mission." "Rest easy, General." Angela put the phone down and let the quiet settle. For the first time since that night, she felt she could breathe without weight pressing against her chest. Still, there was one thing left undone. She opened the wooden box again, the medals glinting softly. From inside, she pulled the bronze star and set it on the table. She stared at it a long moment, then whispered, "Not for me, for all of us." She thought of the young desk clerk who had spoken out, of the niece who had asked why people were cruel, of her mother who had urged her to fight with truth. This was for them, too. The next morning, Angela received an invitation to speak at a university event on civic duty. She hesitated, then agreed. Standing before the students, she told her story, not to dwell on pain, but to teach resilience. "You will face moments where your dignity is tested," she told them. "When that happens, remember, calm is not weakness, truth is not noise, and dignity is not theirs to give or take, it is yours to carry." The students rose in applause. Angela felt a quiet pride, not the sharp pride of medals or parades, but the gentle pride of planting something lasting in the minds of the next generation. That night, she walked past the mirror in her hallway. Her hair had grown just enough to soften the starkness. She touched it briefly, then smiled. It wasn't about what had been taken. It was about what she still carried: strength, grace, dignity. "If you've been moved by this journey," she said softly into the silence, imagining her soldiers, her community, even strangers listening, subscribe for more heartfelt stories. She chuckled at the phrase, but in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of many stories yet to be told. The weeks following the final hearing passed more quietly than Angela expected. The cameras moved on, chasing the next headline, the next scandal. The noise faded, leaving behind the soft hum of everyday life. For Angela, that was a blessing. She had never wanted the spotlight. She only wanted truth. And now that truth had been named. She felt a peace she hadn't known since that night in the holding room. Her mother was the first to notice the change. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, her mother smiled faintly and said, "You're lighter now, Angie. I can see it in your shoulders." Angela chuckled. "Maybe, or maybe I've just remembered how to breathe." Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. "Don't underestimate what you've done. You carried this, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever felt invisible." Angela looked out across the yard, where children rode their bikes down the sidewalk, laughter trailing behind them. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to simply watch, to let the sweetness of ordinary life seep in. She realized that was what she had fought for all along, the right for people to live without fear, to laugh without worry of being diminished. But her journey wasn't finished. Letters continued to arrive, handwritten notes from veterans, young students, mothers, even a retired police officer who confessed the system had been broken for a long time. One letter from a woman in another state struck her most. When they humiliated you, they humiliated us all. But you stood tall, and now I feel like I can too. Angela folded that letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box with her medals. To her, it was worth more than any ribbon. In the following months, Angela was invited to speak at town halls, schools, and community meetings. At first, she hesitated. She was not a politician, not an activist by nature. But each time she spoke, she realized people weren't looking for speeches. They were looking for honesty, for someone to remind them that dignity is not a gift, but a birthright. She often carried a single photograph with her when she spoke, the same one her old unit had sent in that anonymous package. She would hold it up, showing the faces of men and women standing arm in arm in desert dust. "These people taught me what it means to stand together," she would say. "That's what this moment is about. Not division, not anger, but standing together." Her calm, steady presence resonated. She never raised her voice, never called for outrage. She simply asked for fairness, for procedures that saw people first as human beings. It was this tone, measured, compassionate, that won hearts more than any fiery speech could. At one community event, a young woman approached her afterward, tears in her eyes. "My brother was treated badly by officers too," she said. "We felt like nobody cared. But when I saw your story, I realized we weren't alone." "Thank you." Angela embraced her gently. "You're not alone. None of us are. That's why we speak. That's why we keep going." Her words spread slowly, like seeds planted in soil. And though reform came in small, sometimes frustrating steps, she knew change was happening. Policies were rewritten. Training programs were enforced. The Independent Review Board, once only an idea, began to meet regularly. None of it erased what had been done, but it built a foundation for better days. Yet Angela never let herself be carried away by triumph. She knew how fragile progress could be. She carried both pride and humility, recognizing that her story was just one among many. What mattered was the collective push toward dignity. One evening after a long day, Angela returned home to find her niece waiting with a sketchbook in hand. "Look, Auntie," the girl said shyly, flipping it open. Inside was a drawing of Angela, standing tall with her shaved head, medals floating like stars around her. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, the girl had written, "Strength is calm." Angela's throat tightened. She pulled her niece close, whispering, "You have no idea how much this means." For the first time, she felt the story had not just been endured, it had been transformed into a lesson for the next generation. Months turned into a year. Angela's hair grew back, soft curls framing her face. But she never forgot the feel of her bare scalp, the vulnerability of that night. Instead of erasing it, she kept one of the fallen braids, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, tucked inside the wooden box. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of resilience. A piece of her dignity taken, yet never truly lost. The final chapter of this journey came not in a courtroom, nor on a stage, but in a quiet moment at her church. During a Sunday service, the pastor invited her to speak. Angela stood at the pulpit, the familiar faces of her neighbors before her. She spoke not of hearings or headlines, but of gratitude. "I've learned something through all of this," she said softly. "Justice is not about punishment, it's about restoration. Dignity is not something others can cut away. It is something we carry inside. And hope is what keeps us moving when the world tries to make us still." Her words hung in the sanctuary, gentle but powerful. When she finished, there was no applause, no loud cheering. Instead, there was silence, the deep, respectful silence of people who had truly heard. That night, Angela sat once more at her kitchen table. She placed the wooden box before her, opened it, and laid the letter from the woman, the photograph from her unit, and the sketch from her niece alongside her medals. Together, they formed a tapestry of her life: service, sacrifice, family, community. She closed the box slowly, her hand resting on the lid. "It's enough," she whispered. Not in defeat, but in peace. Outside, the world moved on. Children laughed, cars passed, neighbors called good night across the street. Life was ordinary, and that was its own kind of victory. Angela leaned back in her chair, eyes closing as the quiet settled around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. And perhaps that was the greatest medal of all. So if you've walked this journey with Angela, if her calm strength and dignity touched something in your heart, take a moment, like this story, share it, pass it on. Let others know that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands tall, steady, and unbroken, because in the end, Angela Morris was not defined by the night her hair was taken. She was defined by how she carried herself after, with grace that no clippers could cut away, and that is a lesson worth remembering, wherever you are.